Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar. My name is Michel Masson, and I'm the CEO of Infrastructure Victoria. We're absolutely thrilled to have you with us today for what is a big milestone for our organization, which is the launch of the draft 30-year infrastructure strategy, which reflects the refresh of the strategy from 2016. Today really marks the commencement of the public engagement with a 3-month of consultation and discussion. And we're very strong on that. It is a draft and it is the beginning of a discussion. Before we begin the official proceedings, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we all are and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. Now, the American Secretary of Defense put to fame the terms knowns unknowns and unknowns unknowns to qualify events which may unfold in the future. I think we can all conclude that with the summer bushfires, a global pandemic, and a general level of tension on the geopolitical sphere, we've seen quite a few of those unfolding. Now, far from undermining the benefits of good planning, it actually underscores the need to ensure that we got a strategy that is resilient and adaptable. It is exactly in that spirit that for the past couple of years, we've actually researched and consulted widely to prepare the draft strategy that we're so pleased to share with you today. We wanted it to be a practical and a workable plan that, of course, addresses the long-term challenges that we have, taking into consideration the acceleration of past trends into account. But we also wanted to provide short-term responses to stimulate the economy post-COVID, taking into consideration that population growth, certainly for the foreseeable future, is no longer such a priority. At Infrastructure Victoria at that stage, we've got a very simple vision, and that is that collectively, all of us, we've got a unique opportunity to design a better new normal, harnessing all of the positive changes that we've witnessed and displayed ourselves, but also taking head-on the challenges we know we have whilst preparing for those that we don't know yet that we will. So we hope that it is in that same spirit that you will consider the draft strategy and be part of the conversation that we want to have with you, that conversation that starts today. So today we'll hear from Jonathan Spear, Deputy CEO Infrastructure Victoria, who led successfully the process of bringing that strategy through. Jonathan will present a summary of the draft 30-year infrastructure strategy, and then we will open up the webinar for questions. In doing so, we will be joined by Llewellyn Rendiers, who is the mastermind and the architect behind that strategy, and who will respond to the questions together with Jonathan and I during the webinar. We may not be able to answer all of the questions, apologies for that, but we'll certainly do our best to address as many as possible. So just a couple of housekeeping formalities before I hand over to Jonathan. If you could please mute your microphones. Please type any questions you have into the discussion panel on the right-hand side of the screen, and make sure you include your name and your organization. And we are recording this webinar, so you will be able to refer to it at a later stage. So ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great pleasure to invite Jonathan to join us and present to you that draft 30-year infrastructure strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us. So what I would like to do is take you through a tour, if you like, of the strategy to give you a really good sense of where we've come from and where we're going and how you can be involved. So as Michelle mentioned before, the 30-year infrastructure strategy was first produced in 2016, and because of those various changes that Michelle's been referring to, they really show a good reason why regular updates are needed, which is what we're doing now with this update at the moment. And it is a draft strategy. We're seeking community and stakeholder input before we deliver a final version of the strategy in mid-2021. and that will be tabled in Parliament, and the Victorian government will be required to formally respond to the strategy. So before we dive into the detail, it's really important, I think, to get a grasp of what are we trying to achieve here. So there are a range of objectives that this strategy is trying to achieve that we have actually undertaken consultation on previously. We're seeking to do things like preparing for population growth, which may have slowed at the moment, but we anticipate will come back to some degree in coming years, certainly over the next 30 years. We want to lift productivity in our economy. We want to reduce social disadvantage, and we want to have a more sustainable Victoria that helps us to address some of the challenges, like achieving, climate change mitigation and building resilience to some of those shocks that are coming up to us. So we've got a variety of themes, 4 key themes that the strategy addresses. The first one is absolutely about addressing the long-term challenges that we as a state face. The second big theme is how do we manage urban change as our population changes and our economy and our environment. The third is that we have got a range of infrastructure already that we need to make better use of, as well as very carefully planning and delivering additional infrastructure to help drive productivity and growth in Victoria. And last but by no means least, we've had a very strong focus in this strategy on how regional Victoria can be developed, both economically developed, but also from a social perspective to address disadvantage and foster well-being and inclusion. And what I'll do is take you through each of these themes and give you a sense of some of the key recommendations we're making and the questions that we have for you to address during this consultation period. So when we're talking about addressing long-term challenges, some of the recommendations that we're making are things like the importance of accelerating the uptake of low and zero emission vehicles, as well as driving the uptake of renewable energy generation, which then needs to be connected to good, reliable transmission infrastructure. What we want to do is also make sure that the water system that we have is going to be resilient to climate change, and that everyone is clear about what the roles and responsibilities are as we seek to make sure we've got a climate change resilient water system. Really important is our freight network. So both for Melbourne, but especially for the regions, if we've got an efficient, secure freight network that connects to our ports and has good rail and road connectivity, that will really set us well up for the future. And of course, reducing waste and improving recycling infrastructure is something that Infrastructure Victoria has done a lot of work on in the last year or two. And so you'll see recommendations that are consistent with our previous advice to government about the importance of getting going with delivering additional recycling infrastructure and that the economic opportunities that has, especially for regional areas. I want to hear from Victorians about how we can support transition low and zero emission vehicles. And in fact, we are out to seek people who would like to take part in a deliberative process that will be running in January and February to look at this information in detail. So if you'd like to take part in that, please see the details on our website. We're interested in hearing from people about what they think the best ways are to improve energy efficiency in our buildings, because if we have more energy efficient buildings, not only is that more comfortable for us and reduces our hip pocket expenses, but it also reduces the infrastructure that we need to build to supply that energy. And as we look to consider all forms of water supply, we're interested in people's feedback about whether they are prepared to accept alternative water supply sources, such as recycled water for drinking, and are there things that concern them about that we need to start to address. So when it comes to the theme of managing urban change, our recommendations highlight the importance of integrating land use and infrastructure planning. so that and one of the ways to do that is to have clear, publicised infrastructure plans across a range of sectors, including transport, so everyone can know what the plans are and therefore shape their investments and their decisions accordingly. We also think that people should be encouraged to have a more diverse housing options in places that are well located and established areas. So we can have greater numbers of our population as it grows, located in our cities where there is good existing or planned transport and other infrastructure that we can make better use of. We've all seen during the COVID pandemic that we've increasingly valued being able to have good walking and cycling infrastructure, as well as the green spaces that enable that. And so we've got recommendations there about prioritising the delivery of those. We know, for example, that good separated cycling infrastructure is a key element of getting people on their bikes. We've got recommendations about how to make better use of the tram, the road and the bus networks as well. We're recommending that there be boosting of the tram network where there is future growth projected, and reallocating of road space, either for additional public transport so we can perform better and more reliably, or as we've seen recently in our streets, reallocating that space to help with restaurants and cafes or other outdoor uses that we know are really important for the recovery from COVID. Of course, Infrastructure Victoria has previously had a lot to say about using pricing for roads and public transport to both manage transport demand, but also to make it fairer for everybody. So we are calling for continued implementation of things like distance-based road user charging, along with reduction of some of those fixed upfront fees we pay, such as registration, but importantly that be complemented by public transport fare reform. So greater use of off-peak fares and lower costs to travel on buses and trams. And when just delivered as a combination, we know from the modelling and other work we've done already that that is a really effective way of managing transport demand and can be very positive in terms of reducing people's expenses. So what we want to hear from people in relation to that are things like, if we're going to publish long-term infrastructure plans sector by sector from the government, things like a transparent transport plan or in other sectors, how can the government most appropriately manage community expectations about when and how that will be delivered? We're interested in hearing from people about what it is that will enable us to allow more homes to be built in well-located, established suburbs so that we can make better use of that infrastructure, and if there's things that concern communities about doing that. We're interested in having feedback about priorities for improving accessibility of public transport infrastructure, because we know that people who are mobility impaired continue to struggle to get full accessibility on our public transport network. And there are a variety of reviews underway from things like the bushfires, but also a range of other royal commissions that are relevant to the commission. And so we will be very carefully in their findings, and we're interested about relevant as we shape future infrastructure priorities. When it comes to harnessing infrastructure for productivity and growth, you'll see that we have made recommendations about making better use of a strong interconnected bus network, which is underused and a little bit underloved. And we think that there are real opportunities to make better use of that through better service delivery combined with cheaper fares for use of buses. We've got a range of recommendations about major transport projects, things like delivery of Melbourne Metro 2, delivery of tram connectivity to new growth areas such as Fisherman's Bend, continuing to disentangle the city loop so we have more trains running end to end through the network. We're also interested in keeping our options open on new road investment and delivering additional roads, especially in outer suburbs where there is important connections to jobs and growth precincts. Speaking of outer suburbs, perhaps some people are surprised that we consider more tree canopy to be infrastructure, but that is the way we think about it. And what we have observed and heard from stakeholders is that the outer growth areas and really could do with much higher levels of tree canopy. Currently, it's about 5%, and we think something more like 30% of the area of being tree canopy covered would really have good benefits, both for the amenity of people who live there, but also to enable people to use active transport and to reduce the effects of climate change. We've also got some important recommendations about social infrastructure, including additional social housing, but also really importantly, the government engage with and co-design community-controlled infrastructure with Aboriginal communities to progress their path towards self-determination. So some of the things we're interested in hearing from you about is how can we encourage Victorians to value buses for public transport journeys and use them more? What would be the things that would make the biggest difference? What is the best way that we can make sure that when we open up growth areas in greenfields or established areas where we're planning to have more population, how can we make sure that the infrastructure that those growing populations need is delivered on time? We have recommended that there be a 4.5% target for growth in social housing. And what the government has recently announced in terms of social housing is a really good start on that. We're going to need to do some more. So we're interested in people's feedback on, what the target should be and whether we should be setting such a target. And when it comes to developing regional Victoria, we've had a strong focus on both how to build on the economic strengths that regional Victoria has, but also address some of the social disadvantages that we know is there. And we've been working with regional Victorian stakeholders for the last couple of years to better understand what is going on there and what their needs are. And so some of the recommendations you'll see there are about securing long-term funding for road and rail maintenance, which is important for safety of regional communities, but also important for productivity of businesses. Continue to enhance the connectivity and resilience of that connection in regional areas is critical, both for safety in bushfires, bases, and for business to grow. Speaking of businesses growing, we've got quite a few recommendations about continuing to foster regional tourism, especially nature-based or Aboriginal tourism opportunities, which will be particularly important for the COVID recovery. One of the things that we've identified, of course, is the opportunity to use enhanced digital connectivity to boost service access for things like telehealth when people live in remote locations. And what we want to hear from people about is whether that's going to work for them. And one of the ways we really encourage you to do is look at the very detailed regional profiles that we have published on each of the regions, where we've gotten to the detail of what is distinct and unique about each region, what other infrastructure needs that we've identified and the recommendations that we've made, because we think that that's a really important way of coming to this. And we want to get feedback on whether we've got that right after the extensive consultation we've had with regions so far. So we want to hear about things like whether having a clear road hierarchy in the regions, prioritization and classification of roads, and then far more secure funding for their maintenance upgrading is something that's going to work for regional Victorians. We want to hear about what might be the particular places or types of tourism infrastructure that can be delivered now and in the future to help with economic growth in the regions. And we've heard a lot about public transport connectivity within each region often being really unsatisfactory and not meeting people's needs. So what would be enough to make a difference so that public transport is really serving the needs of regional Victorians. As Michelle mentioned, we've also got some short-term priorities. And what we've done is thought about, in recovering from COVID and building a better new normal, what are some of the actions that we can be taking through investment in infrastructure over the next 1.5 to 2 years that will create jobs in Victoria, help us transition to a better new normal, and stimulate the economy. And some of those actions that we've identified are things like upgrading and delivering additional social housing, which was pleasing to see the Victorian government making a strong commit to in the recent budget. Delivering regional road and rail freight maintenance, which in many areas is not serving the needs of manufacturers and farmers and freight service providers. Enabling more active transport and increasing interconnectivity of open space in Melbourne, but also in regional cities. That's becoming increasingly important. And of course, continuing to support better mental health and physical health with the infrastructure that underpins it, along with service changes. So at Infrastructure Victoria, we take consultation and engagement very seriously, and that's why this strategy is a genuine draft that is out for consultation for 3 months. And what we're intending to do between the draft and the final is to integrate all the input that you can give us, feedback, any additional evidence, any nuances, as well as whole new recommendations. If you can bring forward evidence about the need for that, we'd be really pleased to hear it. We are also undertaking additional modelling and costings and research that will feed into our final strategy. And we are going to deliver that to Parliament in mid-2021. And when it gets tabled in Parliament, every political party gets to see it, and it'll be published for everybody's information. And the government of the day will need to respond to the recommendations of a strategy and issue a 5-year plan about what it's going to do. And so this is a rare opportunity for all Victorians to have their say. You know, whether you live in Carlton or Cranbourne, Mildura or Mallacoota, we want to hear from you about what you think about this draft strategy, so you can help us build a better final strategy. We've been very pleased to see the number of recommendations that Parliament and government have taken real interest in implementing since 2016. So we're going to be talking to community members. We're going to be undertaking a dedicated deliberative engagement process on how we can seek uptake of additional electric vehicles. We're going to be speaking with stakeholder groups, peak stakeholder groups and regional stakeholder groups, for example. And of course, Commonwealth, state and local government are groups that we would really check on. I mentioned the deliberative engagement. So the question we are asking 450 Victorians from all backgrounds and places is, how can we support more people to adopt low or zero emission vehicles sooner? Because if we don't do that, we're not going to reach the carbon emission targets that the Victorian government has set. And we're currently recruiting for that. So if you or friends or stakeholders you have are interested in taking part, please jump on our website and you can see all the information about registering there. So really encourage you to register to participate in some of our upcoming events and share feedback on the draft strategy, which closes on the 26th of February. And there's a number of ways of doing that. One is to take part in that deliberative engagement I was mentioning. You can also make a submission or participate in surveys that we have on the Engage Victoria website. We'll be running workshops in mid to late January through February, and also a range of focus groups in February. And so more information about those will be forthcoming as well. So with that, I think we'll hand over to any questions that you would like to raise regarding the draft strategy. Really welcome that. And I'm going to hand over to Maddie, who's going to facilitate those questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jeanette. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that comprehensive presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, if you feel that your head is spinning around, given the depth and the breadth of the strategy which was presented, that is normal. And I would like really to take that opportunity to acknowledge specifically the extraordinary work that the IB team has delivered and undertaken to get us to today and presenting you with this. I can tell you there's been a lot of sweat and tears behind this work to get to where we are. So we are immensely proud of what we've shared with you today. Before we go to the questions, I would like to really underscore a very important point, which really underlines why you should care to be part of the discussion. And that is that Jonathan mentioned that we will table the final strategy in Parliament mid-2021. But what I would like to reinforce is the fact that the way it works is the following. The moment Infrastructure Victoria tables the final strategy in Parliament, the government has got up to 12 months to respond publicly to our strategy, to our recommendations, but also presenting to us, the community, everyone, their 5-year infrastructure plan as to what they are going to focus on. But it doesn't stop here. Infrastructure Victoria then has got the obligation, that's in our legislation, to assess independently what this 5-year infrastructure plan is from the Victorian government, just to reassure ourselves that this is not a token exercise that's been done, but really serves the strategic objectives and the purposes that we've identified in our strategy. And we make that independent assessment publicly available through our annual report, which itself is tabled in Parliament and available to everyone to see. So all that to say that the paradigm of accountability and transparency is such that we really want to make sure that what we table middle of next year in Parliament benefits from your input, benefits from your value. And it doesn't just reflect what Ivy thinks, but brings a sort of an integrated view, a consensus of what we, Team Victoria, think what the priorities should be for the consideration of the government. On that note, Mandy, over to you for the questions.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And at this point, I just wanted to introduce again Llewellyn Reinders. He's our Manager of Strategy and Policy. Thanks for joining us, Llewellyn. I'll just throw to you first, if I may. And our first question from the audience is just what actions has the government adopted since the last strategy in 2016?
Great question, Maddie. Now, in 2016, we released our first strategy, which had 137 different recommendations in it. And we've actually undertaken an extensive exercise of going back over those, recording what they were, recording the government response, looking at all the actions that have happened since, and also indicating how those appear in the new strategy where they do. But what we saw was we've documented 27 of those recommendations being complete, another 95 are already underway, and only 15 have not commenced yet. So that's an 89% hit rate for our 2016 recommendations. And I think that gives an indication of how seriously our recommendations are taken by the Victorian government, and also the real impact that they've had over the last 4 years in helping steer the direction of infrastructure policy in this state.
Great, thank you so much, Llewellyn. I will also throw the next question to you as well. And this is from Kumi, and she's asked, how has the pandemic changed your assumptions of infrastructure needs, for example, population growth and behaviour change?
Fantastic question, Kumi. And look, it's something that, you know, a year ago, we were not expecting to deal with these circumstances, but we have quite deliberately not used a single estimate of the future or a single future scenario. So we've undertaken quite a bit of modelling, and we've released that modelling report today, which actually looked at a whole bunch of different scenarios for the future. So some with higher population growth, some with lower population growth. We've also looked at different distributions of population across the state. So this approach is called scenario analysis. And what it means that instead of presuming a single future, we consider different possible futures and then test our draft recommendations against those different scenarios to make sure that they still stack up. So you can be assured when you look at our recommendations that we've thought quite carefully about, will we need all of this infrastructure even if population growth is lower? And the conclusions we've come to are, yes, we do, or indeed, we may have made a recommendation, for example, that we need to keep this option open in case we need it, but we don't need it yet. So I would certainly encourage people to have a look at some of those scenarios, but also keep that in mind when they're looking at the draft recommendations in the report.
Thanks for that answer, Llewellyn. And obviously this webinar being online is just an example of how things have changed, because we might all have been in the same room previously. I might also now throw this question to Jonathan, if I may, and this is from Ian, and it relates to green hydrogen. Ian asks, many countries are now preparing to transition to green hydrogen, and Australia has been identified as a hub. And have you allowed for this change in the strategy?
Yeah,
Jonathan?
that's a good point, Ian. And so we've been doing some thinking and following very closely the progress on hydrogen.
I think we've actually just lost Jonathan. I can't see him on the screen. So I might, oh, there he is back again. But I think we might be having some technical issues. So I might try and see, oh, you're here. Okay. I'll throw back to you again. Oh,
Shall I
thanks
try?
for that.
So this is probably more relevant to the previous question about adapting to COVID and its effects. So bear with us with the technology. So Ian's question about hydrogen is a good one. And we've been giving quite a lot of thought to hydrogen over the last couple of years and following developments in this in a couple of ways. So firstly, this uptake of zero emission vehicles well and truly includes a consideration of the role of zero emission vehicles that might be hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And the evidence so far is that there's a good prospect of them being a viable alternative for heavier vehicles like buses and freight. And so that's part of the considerations for that uptake of zero emission vehicles. The other part that where hydrogen comes in, of course, is the gas network. And we've got some recommendations and considerations in the strategy about that. There is a lot of uncertainty about the gas network. Of course, natural gas is very important to Victoria's energy mix at the moment, and we have a lot of assets there. And so the question is whether it can be adapted over time to also accommodate increasing amounts of hydrogen, which, as Ian says, might be generated from renewable sources. So what we're recommending to the government is to not insist that new housing estates be connected to natural gas, and to do a review and consideration of exactly part of this question that Ian's raised, which is what is the future role of gas in all its forms? You know, it could be natural gas, it could be renewable hydrogen, it could be biomethane, and whether we can include that in the energy mix so that we can still achieve the net zero emissions target that we have for 2050 that Victorian government's legislated. So I'll probably hand back to you now, Maddie.
Thank you. And I do have another question to come your way, Jonathan, and this one is from Amanda. And she's asked, what are the big infrastructure priorities for the next 30 years? And that's a very big question, but I'm guessing you can give her the shortened version.
Yeah, look, Amanda, this is like asking me to choose favourites amongst my children. I can't do that, at least not publicly. But I think when we think about priorities, that some of those long-term challenges that we've identified over the next 30 years are some big ones for us to address. So we think it's really important that we navigate the energy transition with new renewable energy generation, especially in regional areas, connecting the transmission of those lines, and also reducing demand on energy through greater energy efficiency. We think it's really important that we start to take further steps to adapt to the effects of climate change. So more deliberately planning for tougher climate conditions in our infrastructure, protecting our coastlines, making sure our social housing is more resilient to higher temperatures, and especially making sure that our water systems can still deliver water from sources that aren't as reliable on rainfall. We think that over the next 30 years, there's going to be some really big technological opportunities for us to grasp, and we should be able to do that in a way that delivers lots of benefits. So some examples of that are the rise of increasingly automated vehicles that have lots of opportunity for efficiency and safety if done the right way. Service delivery that can be done online. So we've seen through COVID that when the bandwidth works, we can get some great telehealth. We can get some great government services and commercial services, and so that's important for the state in terms of how it delivers things like health services to people in remote areas, but it's also important to business in regional areas. So there's some of the big challenges that we've got over the next 30 years that we've identified that need to be addressed.
Thanks for that. I might turn to Llewellyn again now, and this question has come through from Guy, and it relates to the target for 30% tree canopy in growth areas, and he's just asked what changes would be needed to the planning scheme for that target to be met.
So thanks for the question, Guy. And I guess we are considering a number of different mechanisms to achieve that target. So one of the considerations is we want to ensure that both, I guess, the public land in new growth areas and private land contributes to that 30% tree canopy. Because what we're seeing, particularly in some of the new growth areas, is very small lots, quite large houses, and not necessarily a lot of private space in those lots in order to grow trees. So we need to consider options around not only using things like public parks and ensuring the funding's there to maintain those parks and maintain those trees, but also things like road easements, private backyards, community facilities, and looking, even sporting facilities for open green space. So there are a whole range of different opportunities to achieve that, but it will require changes to the planning process, and indeed I believe that there's a draft guideline out at the moment that looks at how to achieve a 30% tree canopy cover in those areas. So we're really interested in feedback from you about, if that were to be the target, what are the best and most efficient ways to achieve it, looking at all of the options that can contribute to that better tree canopy.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Llewellyn. I also have a question just relating to the strategy referring to improving the mental and physical health of Victorians. This one's come from Olivio. And we're just wanting to elaborate on what we actually mean by infrastructure to support better mental and physical health. I might throw to you, please, Jonathan, on that one.
Yeah, sure. So there's a variety of ways we can approach this. So part of it is some of those things I was speaking about earlier about, active transport, green spaces, and even the energy efficiency of homes are all things that are actually help promote people's health and well-being. But of course, it's more than that. Our hospital and health systems, while they primarily rely on great staff and dedicated technology, actually have underpinning it infrastructure that's really important. So we've made recommendations about completing the rebuild of the Royal Melbourne Hospital, which of course government has announced plans to study recently, as well as planning to upgrade the Alfred and the Austin hospitals. But it doesn't stop there, because we know that it's not all just about those major hospitals. It's also hospitals in growth areas in Melbourne and also regional cities where we know that additional hospital infrastructure is required. On top of that, there's additional mental health infrastructure, which the Mental Health Royal Commission has identified a need for. There is additional alcohol and drug rehabilitation facilities, especially in regional areas where currently that is underprovided. And also there is the opportunity to consistently invest in health technology to drive a more
I think we're again having some technical challenges with Jonathan's internet, so my apologies for that. It might be a good point to just let you know that if we don't get to any of your questions today, you can absolutely email us at inquiries@infrastructurevictoria.com.au and we will endeavour to respond. Michelle, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Excellent. I might throw to you if I may. I had a question from Kristen, and she's just asking around how local government can be involved in commenting on the strategy.
So local governments form an absolutely fundamental key stakeholders, and we are very, very much willing to hear from you, only by virtue of the sheer size of infrastructure that is on. So the best way to get involved is to seize the opportunity of the next 3 months to first and foremost look at draft recommendations that we have, which are relevant to your own geographical area or points of interest, and then see what's the best way for you to respond. You can lodge a submission on our InfraVic website, or there are some surveys by different sectors and different areas of interest. If there are some questions which Jonathan presented today, which are really of interest to you, you will find the relevant space in that engagement platform to share your questions with us. And I'd like to reiterate really what Jonathan said. It is in our DNA at Infrastructure Victoria to take consultation and engagement very seriously, which means that we listen, we pay attention to what you tell us, and we listen in an agnostic way. We do not pretend that the draft recommendations that are presented to you today are the holy script, far from it. We genuinely want to hear from you, your constructive criticism, new evidence that you may have, things that we may not have considered, because it is through that attentive listening that we will make sure that those final recommendations that are called to the attention of the Victorian government to respond to really captures the views from those who have some expertise around those topics.
Thanks very much, Michelle. All right, a couple of more questions before we think about finishing up for the day. My next question comes from Tilda, and I might throw to you, please, Llewellyn. This is just in relation to the court system and buildings in particular, but I thought it might be a good opportunity just to elaborate on some of the recommendations for the justice system more broadly.
Yes, so we have looked quite closely at the justice system, and I guess broadly speaking, there's a two-pronged approach. So firstly, we're really aware, and COVID has demonstrated amply, that a whole lot of things that the courts did in person and in session can actually be transferred to online. Not everything can, and there's certain parts of the justice system where it's not appropriate to transfer it. But the first strategy to help deal with the court system, which is actually coming under strain and reaching its capacity, is to move what we can online and improve the backbone of their digital systems so that they can handle that capacity and have that capability. The second thing is to actually plan new court facilities when required to be as adaptable and flexible as they can, so that they can be used by different types of courts for different types of matters and shared between them so that we can maximise the use of that new investment and infrastructure.
Great, thank you very much, Llewellyn. I might try Jonathan again. Can you hear me, Jonathan?
I can, and apologies for the in and out of my connectivity.
Yeah, it's no surprise that the strategy does have a number of recommendations relating to digital communications.
I'll go to many lengths to prove that point.
The next question is a good topic that we haven't really touched on yet, but it is within the strategy, and it comes from David, and it's talking about, obviously we've talked about building energy consumption, but the other question is the material side, and I was just wondering if this was an opportunity for you to talk about some of the recycling infrastructure advice in the report.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good question, David. So we're fully aware that when it comes to energy consumption and renewables, that some of these infrastructure projects can be pretty resource hungry. And so we've got a range of recommendations about recycling and resource recovery. And I think one in particular that we've drawn attention to, and to be fair, a lot of governments and constructors are starting to get onto this, is the importance of using recycled or recyclable materials in construction. And so we're increasingly seeing things like glass sand being used instead of virgin sand. We're increasingly seeing the recycled railway sleepers being used that are made out of plastic instead of red gum. And we are seeing a renewed interest in proving up the technical specifications of recycled product so that it can be used with confidence by councils and state government and federal government contractors. So we think that that's a real opportunity, and good work has been done on this by industry and by Sustainability Victoria, and we'd like to see that continue because it is part of the key to both having more sustainable, lower emission construction of major projects, but also having that end market for that recycled material is super important, because that's what stops stockpiles building up and catching fire, as we've seen in recent years. And so with that, really great connection between using recycled material for some of these big projects. If we can continue that, that's going to be really helpful. It's also really helpful for regional economies, because some of the work we've done has identified that there's big opportunities for regional economic development through greater recycling and resource recovery infrastructure building in those areas.
Thank you very much for that Jonathan. I'm aware we've got a couple more minutes for questions, so I might keep going, but I also wanted to let people know that the slides from today's presentation are now available on our website, so you'll be able to access those along with a bunch of other resources at our website, which is infrastructurevictoria.com.au. I've got a question here from Geeta, and it says, carbon emissions are only one consideration associated with private vehicle use. How will IV's research and recommendations into lower emissions vehicles consider issues such as congestion and optimum land use and the resources required to create and upgrade private vehicles? I know transport is one of your passion projects, Jonathan, so I'm going to throw this one to you, please.
Certainly. Look, there's a bit there in that question, Geeta, but you're on a very important track there. So you might be aware that a couple of years ago, Infrastructure Victoria did a detailed study on the infrastructure requirements for automated and zero emission vehicles, and that's available online. And one of the things that showed, to your point, is that it's not just about emissions reductions. Actually, the tailpipe emissions that we see coming out of internal combustion engines do cause us considerable harm, and we quantified that for Melbourne for the first time, and found that if we could have none of that particulate emission coming out of exhaust and getting into our lungs, the savings of that, in economic sense, the way they quantify that value is about $700 million a year in health savings. So that is something well worth going after. I think part of the other issue here is while we think that zero emission vehicles are very important, they don't necessarily solve congestion. And so some of our other recommendations are critically important. So in particular, moving towards a system whereby we pay more to use the road on a per kilometre basis. And when we drive on roads in congested areas in peak periods, that we have got a price signal around that, for example, in the CBD, is an important part of the formula for us to think about having roads in the future that actually, do have that as emission reductions, but also are operating smoothly. And while there will be additional road projects needed to upgrade our road system, using those pricing mechanisms is a really important part of it package. And it's not just about roads, because actually when people make a decision about are they going to go out the front door and make a journey, be it an electric or hydrogen vehicle or otherwise, knowing what their public transport options are and the price of those is super important as well. And so that's why we're making recommendations like having greater use of off-peak fares and cheaper use of things like buses and trams. And so what that means is that you can actually substitute some journeys between the road and public transport, and people can make a more informed choice about the time of day that they travel. And that package of change is really important now as well as in the future.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Much appreciated. I might just throw to Michelle for a final few words before we wrap up today. I just wanted to also remind people that there are multiple ways that they can get involved and participate, and that information is up on your screen now. There's a surveys, and you can make submissions, and you can participate in online focus groups. So plenty to keep you occupied over the summer, and we really welcome your views from both metropolitan and regional Victoria. And if I could just throw to you now, Michelle, for a few final words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maddie, and thank you very much, Llewellyn and Jonathan, for that brilliant sequence of responses. And we did talk about being adaptable and resilient. I hope that you are convinced that we demonstrated that in managing the technical glitches, which we went through today. So apologies for that. Ladies and gentlemen, it was certainly a great pleasure to share with you that depth and breadth of that draft strategy. As we mentioned, this is the beginning of a discussion, and we're certainly very much looking forward to now interact with you, with your organizations. Please make sure that you leverage the social media. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, to share your impression to your colleagues, to your friends, because we're certainly very determined to talk to as many people as possible in the next 3 months to make sure that, again, we've got as many fingerprints from Victorians as possible in what will ultimately be our 30-year infrastructure strategy, are being that reflecting what Team Victoria thinks the Victorian government should reflect on. So thank you very much for your attention today. Please have a safe and festive season, and we certainly look very much forward to continue to engaging with you when we all come back from a bit of rest after what has been a challenging year. Thank you very much. Stay safe.